What if your only companion in the world's loneliest place became your silent, decaying tormentor? In 1801, on the Smalls Lighthouse, a fragile cage perched on 9 oak stilts, 2 bitter enemies, Thomas Howell and Thomas Griffith, were trapped by a brutal winter. When rescue finally arrived, they found a scene that defies sanity. Howell was a hollow, trembling shell of a man, while Griffith's mangled corpse was lashed to the railing outside, waving through the window with every gust of wind. How did Howell survive months staring into the dead eyes of the man he hated most? And what secrets were buried in that tower of madness? Today, let's journey together into the heart of the Smalls tragedy to uncover the truth behind this maritime nightmare. The Smalls Reef is situated at 51 degrees 43 minutes north, 5 degrees 40 minutes west, approximately 20 miles, 32 kilometers, west of the Pembrokeshire coast in Wales. Geologically, it consists of a cluster of low-lying basaltic rocks that are part of the submerged St. David's Peninsula. Historically, this location represents one of the most critical navigational bottlenecks in the world. It sits directly at the entrance of the St. George's Channel, the primary maritime artery connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the Irish Sea. In the late 18th century, the ports of Liverpool and Bristol were the engines of the British Empire's economy. Thousands of merchant vessels, heavily laden with coal, iron, and textiles, were forced to pass within miles of the Smalls. The danger was not merely the rocks themselves, but the Smalls race, a violent tidal phenomenon caused by the convergence of deep Atlantic waters and the shallower continental shelf. This creates currents exceeding 4 knots, capable of dragging even the most well-piloted ships off course. At high tide, the rocks sit just inches beneath the surface, making them undetectable to the naked eye until impact. And in the winter of 1773, the theoretical danger of the Smalls became a brutal, undeniable reality. On a freezing night in December, the Pennsylvania, a prominent merchant vessel and a vital link in the transatlantic trade route, was navigating its final approach toward the port of Liverpool. She was a heavily burdened ship, carrying a massive cargo of raw iron and timber from the American colonies, materials essential for the British Industrial Revolution. This weight increased her draft significantly, making her slow to respond to the helm and vulnerable to the violent, unpredictable currents of the St. George's Channel. As a powerful southwesterly gale reached its peak, the Pennsylvania was swept into the Smalls race, where the tide accelerated to a lethal speed against the jagged basalt reef. Visibility was non-existent. Without a beacon to warn them, the crew had no indication of the hazard until the hull, weighted by tons of iron, struck the rocks with terminal force. The structural failure was instantaneous. The ship did not merely sink. It disintegrated under the pressure of its own cargo and the pounding surf. All 75 souls on board, crew members and civilian passengers alike, were lost to the sea. Not a single survivor remained to tell the tale, and for weeks, and the shattered wreckage of the ship washed onto the coast of Wales like a silent, merciless accusation that the darkness of those rocks could no longer be ignored. It was from this carnage that John Phillips, a Liverpool merchant, emerged with a vow. He didn't just want to build a warning. He wanted to create something the world had never seen. He famously claimed he would build a tower so singular in construction that it would be known from all others the moment it was seen. But in a move that baffled his peers, Phillips didn't hire a master engineer or a fortress builder. Instead, he turned to Henry Whiteside, a maker of musical instruments. Imagine the irony. A man who spent his life crafting the delicate harmonic curves of violins was tasked with standing against the disharmony of the Atlantic. Many scoffed, believing that a man of music could never understand the violent percussion of a 1,000-ton wave. Construction began in the summer of 1775, but the Atlantic proved to be a relentless adversary. The technical challenge was unprecedented: how to secure a permanent structure onto a basalt reef that was submerged by every high tide. Between June and October, the environmental conditions were so ferocious that out of those 5 months, the crew could only manage 9 days of actual labor on the rock. For the remaining time, Henry Whiteside and his team of Cornish miners were forced to huddle on the desolate, slippery crags for weeks at a time, tethered to iron rings driven into the stone, while their support vessel, the Unity, was driven miles away by gale-force winds, unable to deliver essential supplies or fresh water. Yet, amidst this brutal attrition, Whiteside's unconventional genius took a physical form that defied traditional maritime architecture. Completed in 1776, the lighthouse stood 72 feet tall, but it was a radical departure from the stone towers of the era. It was a skeleton on stilts, an octagonal lantern room perched upon 9 massive pillars. These were not mere logs. They were carefully selected English oak trunks, each nearly 2 feet in diameter, reinforced with cast iron sleeves and cross-braced with iron tie rods to create a flexible lattice-like structure. Whiteside, applying the principles of musical instrument resonance to heavy engineering, understood a vital truth. To fight the sea head-on with a rigid wall of stone was to invite destruction. Instead, he designed a structure with a deliberately high center of gravity and a transparent base. By using 9 pillars instead of a solid foundation, he allowed the immense hydraulic pressure of a 1,000-ton wave to pass through the legs of the tower rather than slamming against it. This wooden spider gripped the reef with iron sockets bored deep into the basalt, designed to sway up to several inches in a storm. It was a masterpiece of passive resistance, a tower that survived by yielding to the very force that sought to destroy it. When the light was finally lit, its impact was immediate. Mariners who once whispered the name of the Smalls in fear now spoke of the comfort provided by its white and green beams. John Phillips had achieved his dream. He had turned a graveyard into a guidepost. But as ships sailed safely past, the world forgot the men inside that swaying wooden cage. They saw the beacon of hope, but they couldn't feel the vibration of the oak groaning under the tide or the terrifying isolation of being suspended above an abyss. The Smalls was a triumph of engineering, but it was also an unintentional psychological trap. As the light began to shine, the stage was set for a human tragedy that no amount of oak or iron could ever prevent. But imagine, if you will, living inside a violin box perched atop 9 wooden stilts in the middle of a winter gale. Every time a massive Atlantic swell hit those oak pillars, the entire tower didn't just vibrate, it swayed, it groaned, it shrieked. The keepers lived in a constant state of low-grade terror, never knowing if the next wave would be the one to finally snap the wood like a dry twig and send them plunging into the black abyss below. They weren't just guarding a light, they were living inside a ticking clock of structural fatigue, their hearts beating in sync with the terrifying rhythm of the swaying floor beneath their feet. The fragility of this existence reached a breaking point in the bitter January of 1777. Henry Whiteside, the instrument maker himself, had returned to the tower with a blacksmith to reinforce the pillars, only to be trapped by a sudden, violent storm. For 2 long weeks, 4 men were huddled in a space designed for 2, watching their provisions vanish. As the food ran out and the fresh water turned to dregs, the silence of the sea became a death sentence. There were no radios, no flares, no way to scream for help over the roar of the surf. In an act of pure desperation, Whiteside wrote a plea for mercy, sealed it in a bottle, and encased that bottle in a wooden crate. He tossed it into the churning white water, a tiny splinter of hope cast into a chaotic graveyard. By a miracle that defies the odds of the ocean, a local fisherman found that crate. The rescue boat arrived just as the shadows of starvation were closing in, proving that at the Smalls, survival was a game of inches and luck. But the strain was too much for a private merchant. By 1778, John Phillips had run out of gold, though his vision remained lit. The responsibility for this harrowing outpost was transferred to Trinity House, the official guardians of the British coast. Under their professional watch, the Smalls was reinforced and integrated into a national network of safety. Yet, no amount of institutional management could change the fundamental truth of the place. Whether owned by a merchant or the crown, the Smalls remained a psychological battlefield. It was a place where the wind never stopped whispering of death, and where the transition of power only meant that a new generation of men would have to learn what it felt like to live on the edge of the world, waiting for the waves to speak. Today we live in an era of relentless connectivity, satellites, instant messages, and global positioning. But 2 centuries ago, the Smalls Lighthouse was more than just a navigational aid. It was a wooden cage suspended over a watery grave, 20 miles from the nearest human heartbeat. Namely, there was no radio to call for help, no flares to pierce the fog, and no established code of signals to tell passing ships that a soul inside was screaming. To be stationed there was to be stranded on the moon, a place where the only constant was the indifferent roar of the Atlantic and the terrifying realization that you were utterly, hopelessly alone. In the winter of 1801, at this desolate place, 2 men stepped forward, Thomas Howell and Thomas Griffith. They were not friends. They were not brothers-in-law in spirit. In the coastal taverns of Pembrokeshire, they were infamous for a bitter, explosive animosity. They were 2 jagged edges forced into a tiny, swaying box, trapped by a winter so brutal it seemed the sea itself was trying to reclaim the land. One was older, weary from years of salt and gale. The other younger, perhaps more volatile. They were a powder keg, waiting for a spark. And as the storms of 1801 rolled in, the world outside simply vanished. They were left with nothing but their hatred, the groaning of the oak pillars, and the mounting pressure of a solitude that can break the strongest of minds. Then, the unthinkable happened. It didn't arrive with a shout or a fight, but with the sickening sound of a body hitting the floor. One night, amidst the deafening percussion of a storm, Thomas Griffith collapsed. Some say it was a sudden internal ailment. Others believe a rogue wave shook the tower so violently that he fell, his temple striking a metal stanchion. Howell rushed to his side, but the life was already flickering out of Griffith's eyes. In that moment, the atmosphere inside the tower shifted. The air grew heavy, thick with the weight of a silence that screams. Howell was no longer just a lighthouse keeper struggling against the elements. He was a man trapped in a tomb with the ghost of the man he hated most. Imagine the paralyzing terror that seized Howell's heart as he knelt beside the cooling corpse. He looked at Griffith and didn't just see a dead man. He saw his own doom. He knew the whispers that lived in the pubs back home. He knew their reputation for fierce, verbal combat. If he committed Griffith's body to the sea, the traditional merciful burial of a mariner, what would the world say when he finally returned alone? He killed him, they would whisper. The arguments finally turned to blood, and the sea hid the evidence. The fear of the gallows was greater than the fear of the dead. Howell realized that to prove his innocence, he had to keep the body. But in the sweltering, cramped quarters of the lighthouse, the reality of decay began to set in within hours. The stench of death became an uninvited guest at his table. Driven by a desperate, fractured logic, Howell did something that still chills the marrow of every sailor who hears this tale. With trembling hands and a mind reeling from shock, he constructed a makeshift coffin out of an old cupboard. He dragged the heavy remains of his enemy out onto the external gallery, 70 feet above the churning white water, and lashed it securely to the iron railing. He thought this act would save him. He thought that by keeping the body outside, he could preserve the evidence of his innocence, while keeping the horror away from his living space. He was wrong. The sea was not done with them. The winter of 1801 intensified, bringing waves the size of cathedrals that smashed against the pillars, shaking the very foundation of Howell's sanity. He cowered inside the lantern room, watching through the thick, salt-streaked glass as the tempest tore at the wooden cupboard. Finally, the makeshift coffin splintered under the relentless pressure of the gale. The wood was swept away into the abyss, but the body of Thomas Griffith remained, caught in the ironwork of the railing. The shroud was ripped away by the wind, leaving the mangled remains of the keeper exposed to the elements and to Howell's constant gaze. And then came the macabre twist of fate that truly shattered the mind. As the wind caught Griffith's stiffening, outstretched arm, it began to move. To the terrified Howell peering through the window, it didn't look like a dead limb buffeted by a storm. It looked like an intentional gesture. It looked like Griffith was reaching out for him. It looked like he was waving. Every time a new gust hit the tower, the dead man would wave at the living man. "Hello, Thomas. I'm still here, Thomas. We aren't done yet." For weeks, Howell had to live in this house of mirrors. He had to perform his duties, trimming the wicks, cleaning the glass, fueling the lamps, all while the rotting remains of his partner danced in the wind just inches away. He was trapped in a psychological cage from which there was no escape. He couldn't look away. For every flash of the revolving lantern light illuminated the hollowed face of the man who refused to leave. He spoke to the corpse, begging it to be still, screaming at it to fall into the sea. But the dead man only kept waving. Days bled into weeks, and the isolation transformed from a physical state into a spiritual erosion. Relief boats tried to approach the Smalls, but the sea was a wall of iron. From a distance, the rescuers peered through their spyglasses and saw a figure on the gallery. They saw a man waving at them, his arm moving rhythmically in the wind. All is well, they signaled to each other. The keepers are active and watching. They didn't know they were looking at a marionette of death. They didn't know that inside, the real survivor was slowly dissolving into a state of catatonic hysteria. When the weather finally broke and the rescuers breached the trapdoor, they didn't find the Thomas Howell they knew. They found a shell, a hollow, unrecognizable creature cowering in the shadows. His hair had turned white, his skin was the color of parchment, and his eyes were fixed in a 1,000-yard stare that saw things no living man should see. He had crossed a bridge into a dark territory of the soul and could never truly find his way back. The youthful energy that had brought him to the tower was gone, replaced by a haunting, ancient fatigue. Thomas Howell was brought back to the mainland, but he remained a ghost among the living. He never returned to the sea. He never spoke much of those months, but his face told the story that his lips could not. The image of that outstretched arm in the storm had burned a hole in his consciousness. This is the true tragedy of the Smalls. It wasn't just a death on the rocks. It was the systematic destruction of a human mind by the forces of nature and the weight of a corpse. Because when the wind starts to howl and the wood starts to groan, you realize that the most dangerous thing in the lighthouse isn't the storm outside. It is the silence within. It is the realization that in the absolute dark, we are our own most terrifying company. Thomas Howell lived the rest of his days as a testament to the fact that while we can build towers to light the way for others, sometimes we cannot find the light to save ourselves. The tragedy of 1801 was not merely a ghost story to frighten sailors. It was a brutal awakening for the British Admiralty and the guardians of Trinity House. It exposed a fundamental flaw in the human architecture of isolation. Before Thomas Howell was brought back to shore, broken and hueless, the rule was simple: 2 men to a light, 2 men to share the watch, 2 men to split the labor. But the Smalls proved that while 2 men can sustain a light, they cannot always sustain each other's sanity. The authorities realized that in the absolute solitude of the ocean, 2 is a dangerous number. 2 is a confrontation. 2 is a rivalry. 2 is a nightmare if one should fall. Because of Thomas Howell's long, dark night of the soul, the law was changed forever. From that moment on, it was decreed that every offshore lighthouse must be manned by at least 3 keepers. Why 3? Because 3 is a community. 3 provides a witness. 3 ensures that if one man dies and another loses his mind, there is still one left to hold the line. This regulation, which stands as a cornerstone of maritime safety to this day, is the silent monument to the suffering of a man who spent months waving at a corpse. But perhaps the most agonizing detail of this entire saga, the part that twists the knife in the heart of anyone who hears it, is the misunderstanding of the waves. During those weeks when Howell was slowly dissolving into madness, several rescue vessels actually managed to draw near the Smalls. Through their telescopes, the captains saw a figure standing on the gallery. They saw an arm moving, rhythmically waving back at them. They turned their ships around, satisfied that the keepers were active and well, signaling all clear to the world. They didn't know they were signaling to a dead man. They didn't know that the wave they saw was not a greeting, but a macabre dance of decay, choreographed by the wind. Imagine Howell inside, screaming for help, watching the very ships that could save him turn away, because they thought his dead partner was telling them to go. The ocean has a cruel sense of irony. It used the evidence of death to prevent the rescue of the living. Nature, however, was not finished asserting its dominance over the wooden spider that Henry Whiteside had built. For over half a century, that skeleton tower stood, groaning and swaying, a testament to unconventional genius. But the Atlantic is a patient predator. In 1833, the sea finally breached the sanctuary. A monstrous wave, a wall of water with the weight of a mountain, slammed into the upper living quarters. It didn't just shake the tower. It tore through the walls, smashing everything in its path. One keeper was gravely injured in the assault, his body broken by the very structure meant to protect him. He would later succumb to those wounds, adding another name to the grim ledger of the Smalls. It was a clear message. The age of wood was over. The sea would no longer tolerate a house built on stilts. By 1861, the era of fragility came to a close. A new titan rose from the rocks, a magnificent granite tower standing 141 feet tall. This was not a skeleton, it was a fortress. Designed with the precision of the Victorian age, it was built to endure for centuries, not decades. This is the tower that stands today, a stoic sentinel of stone that has watched the world transition from sail to steam and from oil lamps to electricity. In 1987, the final human breath left the Smalls when the station was fully automated. The keepers are gone, replaced by silent circuits and unblinking sensors. Today, as you look at the Smalls from a distance, you see a majestic structure, a symbol of human triumph over the chaos of the tides. But if you listen closely when the wind writs through the Atlantic, you can still hear the echoes of the old oak pillars. You can hear the groans of Thomas Howell and the silent wave of Thomas Griffith. We must never forget that the lights we see in the distance are fueled by more than just power. They are fueled by the history of human endurance. We build with stone now, so that no man ever has to live in a cage of wood again. We automate our lights, so that no mind has to shatter in the silence of the gale. But we carry the story of the Smalls with us as a reminder that even in our darkest, most isolated hours, the most vital light we can ever hold is the one we provide for each other. The Smalls is no longer a place of madness, it is a place of memory. And as long as its light flashes across the waves, the souls of those who suffered there will never truly be lost in the dark. Finally, as we stand in the lingering shadow of the Smalls, we realize that every flash of its light is a tribute to human resilience. Thank you for journeying through this haunting legacy with me. From the 75 souls lost on the Pennsylvania in 1773 to the psychological collapse of Thomas Howell in 1801, and finally to the rise of the 141-foot granite giant in 1861. These numbers are not mere statistics, they are the heavy cost of our safety. I have always found a profound personal connection to the silent vigil of lighthouses, as they represent hope in our darkest hours. If you have your own stories of the sea or a fascination with these sentinels, please share them with us in the comments. If this deep dive moved you, please like, share, and follow for more. Thank you, and I will see you in the next episodes on our channel.